Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's business briefing and Q&A with PaxMedica, which trades on NASDAQ under the symbol PXMD. With us today, we have Howard Weisman, CEO of PaxMedica, who will discuss the company's significant achievements during 2023, and we'll take a look at what investors can expect moving forward. We will start with a brief presentation, and then we will open up for a Q&A. I will keep everyone's lines muted throughout the presentation. Participants have been asked to submit questions in advance, but attendees can also type in questions by using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will now turn the call over to Howard. Howard, please go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to discuss PaxMedica and some of our latest news and information about the company and its progress towards getting our drug into the U.S. market. So let me turn to the first slide here, our cautionary note. You can take a quick look at that. And then continuing on here, PaxMedica is a clinical stage company. We are developing a group of drugs called the antipurinergic drug therapies. This is a fairly new area in drug development, but we're actually working with a drug that's been around for some time now. Pax 101, which is an intravenous form of Suramin, is what we're working on most specifically. We have some other products in the pipeline as well, but we've recently demonstrated a statistically significant and clinically meaningful change in the clinical global impression scale during a phase 2 clinical trial for autism spectrum disorder. We are also studying the exact same drug, Pax 101, for its original use, which started about 100 years ago to treat a deadly infection called the human African trypanosomiasis infection, which is a tropical disease also known as African sleeping sickness. So for the investment highlights, we are the only public company that's focused on developing treatments for the core symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. That's significant. There are some other private companies, but this has been a mostly overlooked space by the large pharmaceutical companies. We are preparing for a large clinical trial for Pax 101, our lead drug for autism, and we're hoping to start that here in the United States within the next year or so. We have many catalysts coming through 2024, including this start of a new trial in autism spectrum. But what's up really right now, what's right in front of us, is getting ready to file an NDA for Pax 101 for the treatment of African sleeping sickness, which we've just completed a study for in Africa. We expect to file that NDA in 2024, and it could be potentially subject to an award of a rare disease priority review voucher, which we'll talk about in just a moment. This is a very valuable piece of paper, actually, but can be transacted anytime after we receive it. We have capital in place for our near-term needs now. We are raising capital for longer-term needs, and we have an independent board and management team made up of some of the most experienced people in the industry. So let me turn to the treatments for autism that we are excited about. First, let me just tell you that this is I don't want to use the word health epidemic, but other people have used that word. When I first started with PaxMedica 3 years ago, this same slide said 1 in 48 children in the U.S. diagnosed with autism at the average age of 8. It has now gone to 1 in 36. That's a significant change in about 5 years. The awareness, of course, is increasing. That's part of it, but actually the incidence of it is increasing too. So today, however, despite the fact that there are a number of children being diagnosed, there still are no FDA-approved treatments for the core symptoms of autism. This is a deficit in social communication, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, and a significant impairment in daily functioning that is permanent. It's lifelong. The market itself, when you look at the treatments, the drugs actually that are sold to the families for their children, this is a large market already, and yet none of this is treating autism's core symptoms. Irritability is very important, of course, and so is attention deficit disorder. These are not core symptoms, but yet they do show up in these children and certainly stay with them as they become adults. This is a large market today in terms of drugs. The market for actual treatments and housing and training is maybe closer to $80 to $100 billion today. So why are we excited about this? Well, we have a new treatment paradigm. We didn't come up with it. This is based on the work from University of California, San Diego, Professor Robert Navio, who was looking at the symptoms in particular for autism and a number of other disorders that seem to have similar symptoms but arise in completely different cases. And in this case, this is just if you will, a diagram showing a potential mechanism that has been worked on by several labs around the world, which essentially starts with a cell, any cell in your body, having purine receptors. These are these funny-looking purple things, and an ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, the most ubiquitous energy molecule and neurotransmitter in the body. Every cell needs it, every cell can produce it, and this is what drives all functions in the human body, in particular immune activation. So here we show a cell swimming around in your body. There's a maternal immune activation, which is what we believe autism may be. And then the cell becomes highly stressed, starts to hyperproduce purine receptors, hyperproduce ATP, and that leads to significant downstream effects in these children. They have significant behavioral problems. They have significant deficits in functioning. And in order to stop that and return that cell to normal, blocking these purine receptors seems to be the only way that does that. That's what the work at Navio's lab showed. We've repeated this study. I'm going to show you that data in just a moment. But the idea here is to restore the normal cell functions. It's okay to have immune activation, but if it just keeps going, then that just creates chronic inflammation. So we want to reduce the inflammation, restore normal cell functions, and improve the cellular signaling, which may be the problem here that causes not only autism, but perhaps some other related syndromes. So our pipeline right now consists of really two drugs and one reformulation. PaX-101, you'll see up top, that's our African sleeping sickness study. We are just finished our phase 3 study. We will be meeting with the FDA upcoming. I'll talk about that in just a moment. In autism spectrum, we have completed phase 2 study. We will repeat a large phase 2 here in the United States as soon as we can apply for an IND. And then we are recently working with a company called Polymar and another group called the Brain Foundation to develop a pipeline compound that we have in our stable, if you will, called Emodin. This is, again, another antipurinergic compound that's going to enter phase 2. The Brain Foundation and Polymar are running a small pilot trial proof of concept for us over the next year. And then finally, PaX-102 is a reformulation, an intranasal form of PaX-101 that we are in preclinical testing with right now. And that is our pipeline today. So let me turn to what we have found with our PaX-101 in a phase 2 trial that we ran finished in 2021 and reported those results with the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the end of 2021. And this is forming the basis for our discussion with the FDA coming up. So we took 50 boys. I think in the end we had 44 that were evaluable, meaning that we had complete data on, and they finished the trial to the protocol. And we studied the effect of PaX-101, which you'll see in the orange bar, versus a placebo, which was literally just a saline infusion. And these ABC scores, right? This is the Aberrant Behavior Checklist adjusted for autism. You'll see ABC1 is irritability, social withdrawal is 2, stereotypic behavior, that's the rocking and the spinning, that's 3, hyperactivity 4, inappropriate speech is 5, that's the lashing out and speaking in a tone that may be inappropriate for the situation. We group these as either core or total. You see that over on the right side. And we saw a change in all of these parameters. And then when we grouped them, we saw the change persisting, obviously, over the period of time. And let me show you just the time period that we were showing 14 weeks of treatment with 3 infusions, 1 at week 0, 1 at week 4, and 1 at week 8. And while you do see a placebo response in all trials that involved analysis, if you will. These are behavioral analyses we're trying to change. We do see a placebo, but frankly, if we didn't see the placebo, it would be more problematic. What's key here is that you can see that the 10 milligram per kilogram dose continues to trend towards improvement. A negative point change on these scales is an improvement over the baseline. I mentioned to you that we had a statistically significant outcome. It wasn't on this scale, it was on this scale. This is the Clinical Global Impression Scale of Improvement. This is a secondary measure that we use. And interestingly enough, the 10 milligram per kilogram group matched up perfectly with having very much improved. This is between the physician and the caregiver. They make an assessment at the end of the trial. what was the level of improvement? Minimally improved, much improved, or very much improved? And here you'll see a very low p-value. The 10 milligram per kilogram group had a significantly positive change from baseline. We think that that creates what we call a signal of efficacy, and now this has to be proved out in a much larger trial, probably 150 to 200 children. We'd like to start that trial sometime late next year. Now, let me talk about what we are doing right now, which is we are preparing the drug for submission as an NDA, but not for autism, for human African trypanosomiasis, which we shorten by calling HAT. This is also known as African sleeping sickness. So Suramin, which is Pax 101, IV Suramin has been for 100 years the standard of care to treat this fatal infection that's caused by this parasite called Trypanosome brucei rodenziens, human African trypanosomiasis. Long name, we call it sleeping sickness. 100 years of use in Eastern Africa, where this infection is endemic, where people are still getting infected, but in small numbers today, thankfully. But this has been a standard for 100 years and yet has never gone through a clinical trial. The drug was introduced into Africa during an epidemic where 250,000 people had already died, and they used it on an emergency basis in the 1920s, stopped the epidemic. There have been a couple of epidemics since then, but nothing really for about 20 years, except for maybe 5 or 10 cases a year. We were able to get the exclusive license to all of the Suramin-treated patients from the area where this is a hotspot, which is now called Uganda and Malawi. We had 3 hospitals that we were able to, with the government's permission and sanction, get the data and then convert that into a digital database to be presented to the FDA, which we are in the process of doing. One of the unique things about this drug is it does qualify under the U.S. federal regulations as an orphan drug in the United States. There are only 1 or 2 cases that have been ever seen of this infection here in the United States. It's usually people traveling back from the endemic area in Africa. But nonetheless, because this drug can rapidly cause death, sometimes patients have come near to death just waiting for the drug to be shipped through the WHO, through the CDC, from the ministries of health in African nations. At any point in time, that supply chain could be stopped. And thankfully, it hasn't yet, but we haven't had a lot of cases. However, under the orphan drug designation, we are able to, if we get this approved, have a monopoly on this drug in the United States and not to have any competition for up to 7 years. That's a unique situation that's very rarely granted. This is a drug that has never been introduced to the United States, which is why it could qualify for this. In addition, any company who sponsors a drug to be under this neglected tropical disease program for FDA review, if approved, that NDA also gives way to what's called a priority review voucher. I mentioned this before. We call them a PRV. This allows any company in any industry, in any category of any drug to go to the FDA with their NDA and demand a priority review. It could save months of review time, which on a patent-protected drug could mean $1 billion or more at the end of patent life if you're able to get a priority review and start the marketing earlier. These are highly valuable. You can look at the GAO report from January of 2020, which lists out about 40 or so of these vouchers that have been transacted over the last several years. We are planning to file an NDA, and we are planning to request a PRV with our NDA. We've been to the FDA several times on this issue, and we believe we have everything lined up that if our NDA is approved, we will likely qualify and receive this PRV. But again, it is all subject to review and the quality of what we bring to the FDA for analysis. And this is what we've just uncovered. We announced this about 3 weeks ago, our PAX 301 trial, which is for human African trypanosomiasis. This is a registrational phase 3, very unusual trial. And I'll just tell you the results right up front. What we found, which has been, I would say, well known throughout the medical community, what we found is that the Suramin-treated cohort, when treated during stage 1, which is when it's in the bloodstream, survived and were able to complete the treatment with Suramin, while the untreated population that we were able to get access to did not. They advanced to what's called stage 2, which is the brain infection, and nobody survives the brain infection, unfortunately. It is fatal, usually within several months. Our p-value for this trial was 0.001, meaning that we have extraordinary confidence that this result is true. And this is the only data available in the world. We were able to secure this through exclusive license with the governments of Malawi and Uganda. This trial just completed top-line results about a month ago. 3 weeks ago. We'll have the full report in September, and we will be bringing this to the FDA to discuss our updated pathway to the NDA. So let me turn to some financials and some goals that we have for the company. Certainly, I just talked about the phase 3 sleeping sickness trial. We're very excited about that because we do believe this is foundational to our NDA and may accelerate in many ways our work here. We have recently granted the distribution rights for PAX101 to a group called VoxNova. They are building a limited distribution specialty pharmacy benefit manager focused exclusively on ASD patients and their families. The idea here is to give them the best service we possibly can when delivering this drug to the market for the very first time. We will likely have limited quantities. Initially, we are making as much drug as we possibly can right now. The good news is we are making a lot of it, but again, there are a lot of people affected here and the demand is already significant, and we want to make sure that we can administer the drug to the marketplace in a careful, well thought out way so that people who really need this, who qualify for it, can get it first. And we can also so we can make sure that we have a supply of drug for anybody who starts this drug, they can always finish their therapy. Again, that goes for our clinical trials. We'll be having the extension of those trials. After people finish trials, we'll be able to put them into an extended trial so they can get the drug. We're trying to do everything we possibly can to address this community head on because we are the only public company focused exclusively on autism. So VoxNova will be, we think, a great partner for us to make sure that families and children get this drug, get it safely, and get what they need from the therapy once it's approved in the U.S. Our CMC supply chain, which is really what you need to have qualified and ready for inspection, is nearly ready. We will be ready by the end of this year to start our process of getting in front of the FDA. We have drug that's ready for distribution into our clinical trial program for early next year. And recently, we've entered into this relationship with Polymar Health and the Brain Foundation to study Imodin. There'll be more news about that later next year as well. A lot of the work for Imodin came from PaxMedica. We demonstrated in animal studies that this drug is active. It is an oral compound, not an IV, whereas PAX101 is an IV. So there could be some advantage to this drug later on down the line. Again, it's a few years away from going into broad trials. I think Suramin will likely be in much larger trials before Imodin, but nonetheless, this is an important, I would say, product for us because it again demonstrates antipyrenergic therapy in action. As many of you have been following our stock, you'll see that the stock has, like many biotech stocks, come under significant pressure. We are working as best we can to reduce our cost of capital, but it's not easy. We've had a lot of short selling that has been very aggressive. We are following up on that with all of means that are available to us to follow up. But the key for us right now is to make sure that we can bring our cost of capital down and also reduce dilution as much as possible, because once that PRV is in hand, which could be 18 to 24 months from now, the PRV will be sold. That is an enormous amount of capital to be able to apply to our business. So we want to be very careful as we lead up to that to not dilute the company, dilute the shareholder base too much and increase our cost of capital. Again, that's something we work on every single day. We are working, of course, to support the NDA submission for the HAD indication. There's a lot more to it than just the phase 3 results we came out with. We've been working on the preclinical and non-clinical studies as well. Those have been ongoing for 3 years now. We'll be finishing up most of that as we get into the end of this year and into next. And then we are planning to ask for a pre-NDA meeting for the FDA. And I'm assuming they will accept a pre-NDA meeting. We have a phase 3 study that's complete. They know we've been working on it. The idea of a pre-NDA meeting at this point right now is to essentially pave the way for the sooner we can, because this infection, while it is now only in Africa, it's just a matter of time with all of the things that are going on with globalization, climate change, et cetera, that this very quickly could turn into something quite dangerous, even here in the United States. Certainly for Americans who travel over to Africa and go on safari, and there are a number of people who are going on those safaris right now, this is a risk nobody is thinking about. You go to East Africa, if you get bit by the tsetse fly and it's carrying this parasite, you're going to need to be treated within 30 to 45 days of your infection starting, which hopefully you're back home by now. Otherwise, you're going to be treated there on site for sleeping sickness. It is a month-long treatment. So this is important for the FDA to look at today, certainly in light of what we've just been through as a country and as a community globally for the last 3 years, with something that certainly was thought to be fairly innocuous and contained and was not. So again, we're moving as quickly as we possibly can to get this NDA submitted. And why that, I guess we can talk about that in a little bit, Stephanie, why that might be important, but there's many reasons why this has to come first. One is because it's available now, the data is here, and we have the drug, and that's been the biggest stumbling block to getting this drug into the United States, is having the drug. We have the drug. That's an important part of this, but getting it approved quickly, the only route really that we can do is this, and this route gives us so much more than just any old indication. This is providing 7 years of exclusivity in the US market and the potential to receive non-dilutive cash from the sale of a PRV. There's no other indication that would have this kind of benefit for the company. We talked quite a bit about this, but I think you may know by now from our recent Q, we have about $3 million in cash in the balance sheet. We've got another $15 million available from our Lincoln Park facility, which had an original face value of $20 million. We've really barely tapped into it. And right now we've got a little bit over 15 million shares of common stock outstanding. So just on the key takeaways, we're the only public company focused on treatments for core symptoms of autism. We have several catalysts coming from now through the end of 2024. You can see them listed out here. We have capital in place for our near-term needs, and we look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Howard. That was great. We'll now move on to the Q&A portion of the presentation. The first question is something you touched on, but this has been confusing to many investors. How does pursuing FDA approval of Suramin for HAT in the U.S. advance PaxMedica's goals for your work in ASD, autism spectrum disorder?
I think it's important to remember that an indication like autism is going to require a lot of clinical study. These are children largely. Yes, there are adults involved, but we've only looked at children. We want to look at adults too. This drug is not very well understood by the FDA. They see it in the context of its use in Africa and its occasional use here in the United States when a patient comes home with the infection. So it's already being used, and yet there's no legal construct for it to be used. And setting that up right now is actually more in demand, if you will, by the US than autism. It's a sad statement to make. We'd like that the FDA would be encouraging us, and they are, to study autism, but it will take longer to study autism than it will to study HAT. And we think that getting all of this data to the FDA about the drug, how we make it, how we can show that it's a quality drug that we make in a facility in Europe and we finish it here in the United States, all those are important parts of this, which we have to do for autism anyway. But to be able to get the benefit out of this program in infectious disease and apply all of that, including all of the work we're doing for this first NDA, is the same work we'd have to do for autism. But we'd have to also do very expensive clinical trials. So this helps pay for those clinical trials. It helps complete the work that's necessary for autism before we start those autism trials. And that's, we think, a very important part of our company's strategy going forward here.
Right. Thank you. So when do you expect to file the NDA for PAX 101 in African sleeping sickness? Is the award of a PRV guaranteed? How is that really determined? How do you think about that?
Let me handle that first part first. There is a process at FDA to award the PRV, and it comes only after you have the NDA approved. So that is a critical part of this. And you have to be the first of that to be, it has to be the first time the molecule goes in front of the FDA. So that's important too. So it has to be a new chemical entity in the NDA's eyes. It has to pass the threshold of having an NDA approved. And then I think the most important thing, which was what the box we checked first, is the infection on the list that Congress approved that is under this program that would be considered to be a neglected rare tropical disease, and T. brucei rodensians is on that list. Suramin is the only treatment for this parasite when it's in stage 1 as a blood infection. There are no effective treatments in stage 2. There are treatments used, but most people either die from the treatment, unfortunately, or die ultimately from the infection when it's in the brain. Now, you asked me about timing. As soon as we possibly can. The most critical piece of information is efficacy. We did an unusual study. The FDA knew this was the only way to do this study, was to pull the charts of treated patients. There is no ethical way to have people get the infection and then decide who should get the placebo, who should get the drug. The FDA knew this, and they agreed with us. This was the only ethical way to study this. We moved as quickly as we possibly could. It took 8 months to collect this data. We had a team of about 6 people in Africa, working weeks and weeks at a time in some of the most dangerous places in East Africa in terms of physical safety and medical safety. And yet this was data that without it, we wouldn't have an NDA to put together. So we want to move as quickly as we possibly can, hence the request for a pre-NDA meeting.
Right. And you publicly said in 2024, you expect to.
We believe that by the end of 2024, this will be filed. The question is, can we do it sooner? And that's what we're asking the FDA.
Okay. Assuming you receive FDA approval of Suramin for HAT, what are your plans? Will we be marketing it in Africa or in other geographies?
Well, possibly. The drug will have to be made available here in the U.S. That's part of the deal with the FDA. You can't just say, I want the approval, and then I'll make it available. It has to be available. So it will be stockpiled here. That's the point of Vox Nova. They're going to be handling the initial distribution of the drug here. It will have an indication for human African trypanosomiasis. And it's possible that under certain circumstances, there may be ways to get access to it, but that's for a later point in time. We need to have the drug approved, and that certainly we think creates a lot of opportunities for clinical trials, frankly, that can be approved much quicker with an approved drug versus having a non-approved drug. So that's the other key, is that having it approved actually should facilitate our clinical trials, both from an enrollment standpoint and the availability of having large-scale trials. Again, I mentioned to you before that there was no drug available anywhere in the world. Even though the drug has been around for 100 years, nobody makes this. Nobody has ever made it on an industrial scale. It's something in an approvable FDA facility or an FDA approvable facility. We're doing that now. That's an important first step. And so once it's approved, the availability will be almost immediate.
Is Suramin hard to manufacture?
It's only hard because there's no previous guidelines. So, it's probably no more difficult than many things, although I'm a chemist by training. There are some very unique steps to it. This is a category of chemicals which has never really had a lot of uses in the pharmaceutical industry. So as a result, some of the intermediates that we have to use had to be custom made. We thought we could buy off-the-shelf intermediates, like if we were making an antibiotic, or if you're making some like a cholesterol drug, you might have a lot of off-the-shelf intermediates because those markets are billions and billions of dollars. In this case, we had to make the intermediates, and we even had to make some of the pre-intermediates as well. That's what took so long. I think others have tried and stopped about a third of the way through because the pre-intermediates are pretty tough. Once you get past that, it's fairly standard fare for pharmaceutical manufacturing, and it is delivered in a powdered form, which is diluted in just before use with plain water. So it's fairly simple once you get past the middle. So we've been making drug for about a year now.
So when do you expect to initiate your next clinical trial for PAX 101 for ASD? And what's the path beyond that to filing an IND for autism in
Um,
autism?
we actually are looking at potentially starting a new trial in South Africa. Um, what I'd like to do, and what we are working on simultaneously, is preparing for an IND submission here and maybe running a global trial. The reason for South Africa is the drug is readily available. It's approved there. There are people with autism there. We ran our first trial there. We had a very good, I would say, experience. It's a good medical community. But of course, South Africa is not the United States, and so we are working as fast as we can. A lot of it is just waiting for the time for certain preclinical toxicology studies to run out, and so those studies are ongoing right now. There are different types of studies that we run to support an autism trial versus what we run to support the infection. Those infection, preclinical and tox studies are largely done, but the autism ones are still going on. So we need to have a few more months, I would say, of that to really be able to predict with great effectiveness when we would file an IND. But we plan to file an IND next year. And again, if we can coordinate a global trial, we'd like to do that too. So we're looking into all of that. This would be a trial, 180 to 200 subjects, most likely between the ages of 4 and 17.
And what's your vision for the Vox Nova relationship? How do you see that relationship developing? What services are they going to provide?
They're primarily going to help connect these patients and their families to a program that will help them get the drug, get a place for drug infusion to take place, reimbursement support, family support. There might be families who have to travel a distance to get an infusion. And again, this is going to be, we think, once every 4 to 6 weeks is the schedule. And so imagine a family might have to travel 100 miles or more for an infusion and might have to bring their family. And those types of real world issues, we're hoping that our partners at Vox Nova, and we're expecting them to, will help families find the resources they need to be able to participate in even a clinical trial. So we're going to rely on Vox Nova to help us essentially with these families. So they will be our exclusive pharmacy, but they're more than a pharmacy. It's not going to be like going to a CVS. They're going to have the ability to really help not only with our drug, but also helping with other prescriptions that these families need, making sure they have the forms that they need. There are some drugs that come in injectable forms and some drugs that come in oral forms. Some should come in liquids. Again, having a pharmacy focused on this community that we have given this exclusive right for, we think gives these families an advantage to have somebody to talk to that really understands what they're going through. And again, our hope is that Sermon gets approved down the line for autism spectrum, and we want to have a nice orderly, if you will, transition to the larger autism market. We know that can be sometimes frustrating when a new drug comes out. People are trying to find it, trying to find where to get it. This is an infusion. It's not a tablet. So as an infusion, there are significant hurdles that could be there in place, and we want to try to remove those hurdles as quickly as we possibly can over the next year, and Vox Nova is helping us do that.
Okay. And you said that that Sermon is a powder that you mix with water. Does that mean it won't be difficult to develop a nasal delivery?
We have a formulation already, which we developed and actually wrote patents around in 2019. So those patents are actually being prosecuted around the world right now. It's a preclinical formulation at this point, meaning that we've only done animal work with it. We will, once we've gotten the program to the FDA, meaning that once we've submitted the NDA, we would like to start our human trials with this. Again, going from an IV to an oral, an IV to an intranasal, or to a transdermal patch, we really have to figure out the dosing. An intranasal dosing may not be once every 4 to 6 weeks. It could be once a week. It could be every day. It could be a very small amount of drug delivered once a day. Those are the issues we have to work out. There may even be other formulations we can use, but the intranasal one, at least with our work, seem to have the best combination of having a very large effect with the smallest amount of drug delivered directly into the olfactory bulb, which is the one of the most early developments of the brain. So that is a fast path into the brain.
Interesting. So, how far after HAT approval will it be manufactured and available in the market, do you think? What's your
Oh, it should be immediate. Should be immediate. We're making it now. We have drug upon stability right now. We'll be making it all throughout next year. And we're hoping that an FDA inspection, once we submit the NDA, can be smooth and fast. That's why we're making we make the actual drug itself, the serum, and what we call the active pharmaceutical ingredient. We make that in Central Europe, in a facility that makes drugs for Pfizer, for Merck, for all kinds of companies. So it's FDA is in there all the time. We chose that facility very specifically, and they've done an amazing job of developing the manufacturing process and of course documenting it fully through a quality system. We finish the drug, meaning we put it in the vial, we turn it into a powder. We do that here in the United States. And that's also for a reason. We want to control the supply chain as best as we possibly can, keep it as close to the US as we can. So, but if we could make the active ingredient here, we would, but it's okay to make it in Central Europe too. We're I won't mention the country right now, but we're in a country that is a very close ally of the United States.
Are there any other drug acquisitions you're considering?
We're always looking for ways to help the autism community. So we have certainly our eye on a number of different possibilities, both in the pipeline. In other words, bringing something in that might actually need one more study to get approved, or maybe it has all of its studies and it just needs to be packaged up into an NDA. Believe it or not, those products are out there. And the other thing that we look at are brands that are used by the autism community that the companies are no longer supporting. And there are many of those where they're hard to get now. And so we're looking at some of those as well, because again, we want to be we want to be the experts in autism spectrum, but not necessarily just for the science. We want to be the experts when it comes to the community that we're serving, because we see that they have been sort of pushed aside almost. They've been left behind, and we understand that. We talk to a lot of families about that. And there's two things that we try to do very, very carefully, which is to give them some hope, but not give them false hope, and to execute the plan as quickly and as well as we can, so that from this point forward, all we can do is to keep the momentum going for the trials that we have, because we're closer than we've ever been to delivering on some promise, which is essentially, can we find out whether or not this is a real effect? Is it durable? And is it applicable across a large number of people in this community? And that's what we're going for next.
So we had a couple of questions on the PRV. So what do you plan to do with it? Do you have a rough idea how much it may be worth?
Well,
assuming you get it.
Yeah, if we get it, we will plan to sell it. There is a market for these. Some years there are 3 or 4 of them for sale. Some years there's none of them for sale. This one will likely be for sale after 2024. So you get granted the PRV on the essentially right after the NDA is approved, as long as everything else has been checked off, which we've already talked about. We've checked off all those boxes. All we need now is an NDA approval. The PRV you have immediately, but it could take a few months to sell it just because it's an auction process. So now I would refer everybody to the GAO report that I mentioned from January 2020. That'll give you the wide range of value. And I'll just tell you, it's from, somewhere in 50, 60 million, all the way up to 300 million. We're not expecting 300 million. That was the very first one that was sold. And again, it's all supply and demand. If there's 2 for sale at once, the prices will reflect that there's just 2 for sale. If there's 5 for sale, the prices will reflect 5 for sale. They don't stay for sale very long.
Wow. That's exciting, potentially. We had a question about the phase 2 study that you did in 2021. Did sermon show improvement in language and speech?
I've been asked that question before because in Professor Navio's publication from 2017, he noted that he had children speaking. We only had anecdotal reports of that, and I wouldn't put a lot of stock in it because we were running a clinical trial with an expected measurement outcome, which you'll see in our ABC5, which is inappropriate speech. We didn't have a lot of change there. We had a number of nonverbal subjects in the trial. Our next trial, we will exclude nonverbals because that does sometimes put a child in a different category. We don't know about sermon's activity well enough to know that it would help a nonverbal child. Spontaneous speech is not something we were asking anybody to look for. We see it in the anecdotal report that speech changed and that these children were far more interactive with siblings and children. But again, I couldn't tell you that somebody who wasn't speaking suddenly spoke for the first time. But Professor Navio reported that. He's one of our advisors and he stands by that, and I'll have to take his word for it. Again, in our next trial, we will have some secondary measures that may help us elucidate that. But the vast majority of children, in fact, all the children that we'll have in that next trial will have some verbal skills, even if it's only word here and a word there. There are, ADOS 10, which is an autism scale that looks at severity. ADOS 4 is very mild severity. These children used to be categorized as Asperger's syndrome. ADOS 10 would be severe. All of those children are nonverbal. And so we are going to limit ourselves to ADOS 9 as an exclusion criteria for the next one.
The Brain Foundation. So you're working with them with Palomar Health. Are you doing other things with them as well? Can they help PaxMedica?
Well, we participate in their programs. We had a similar webinar about a month ago or so, maybe more. That's up on their website, and Sarika and Pramila are both very engaged foundation directors, and they can and have connected us into other communities within autism, people looking for biomarkers, people looking at other drug compounds that may be effective, that may work in combination with anticholinergic agents. So they have a lot of interesting tentacles into the research community, but also into the family community. And we really like the work that they do, and we really enjoy their partnership. And the one thing that we are able to do, and we do a lot, is sometimes we pick up the phone and we just call them and say, "What do you think about this presentation material, this depiction, this anything?" And they try to give us some good advice because we know this community is sensitive to having been, I would say, given a lot of hope over the last several decades, several years, frankly, and having it dashed. And so we use them as a sounding board too. So they're a great group. And we look forward to doing more work with them. The fact that they're going to do this Emotin proof of concept is great for us because it's one less thing that we have to do. And yet when they finish that work, we get to take that and roll it into an IND and do a trial if they're successful and they find a signal and there's no safety issues. So very pleased that they approached us about that and are doing that trial and taking a little bit of the pressure off of us to do everything all at once.
Terrific. This has been great, Howard. Do you have any closing comments before we end?
Just to say this, we appreciate all the investors who have helped us get this far. We're about a year into our IPO. We know that the environment is rough out there for biopharmaceutical stocks, but I've been in this industry for my entire career. I followed my father into it too. There have been times like this before. This too shall pass. The most important thing is that we keep this work going and that we fund the work as best as we can. And we are working on that every single day. So thank you, everybody, for supporting us. And we look forward to coming back to you with some more positive news in the near future.
Thank you, Howard. We've now concluded our presentation. Thanks very much to everyone joining us today. For more information on PaxMedica, you can contact me, sprince at pcgadvisory.com, or visit paxmedica.com for company news and updates. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.